It is difficult for us to imagine a time before headphones and curated playlists, but that was the reality for anyone born before the late 1970s. In the past, listening to music was a regular routine that necessitated creating one's own or going to concerts to experience works that might never be heard again. Later, when music was recorded, it could only be heard in specific locations like a car, venue, or home with bulky audio equipment, making the act of listening to music a social event. However, the Sony Walkman, introduced in 1979, changed the game by letting music fans carry their collections around and listen to them in private no matter where they went. The Walkman's symbolic representation of an era and its lasting effect on society ensure its influence is still felt long after its popularity has waned. Chapter 1. Beginnings of recording music. There is a direct line between the development of the Walkman and the history of the phonograph and the album. Thomas Edison, who is widely believed to have invented the phonograph in 1877, is widely credited with the invention of recorded sound. Edouard Léon Scott of France submitted his phonautograph design for paper recordings to the French Patent Office in 1857, 20 years before Edison's invention was publicly acknowledged. Scott created a device that would have allowed people to read sound waves on paper, but it never caught on. After Edison's phonograph was improved, the recorded sound moved on to wax cylinders, and then, in the 1880s, the flat record was developed by Emil Berliner. Records continued to dominate the market nearly a century after their introduction in 1922 until the introduction of 8-track tapes in 1964. Although 8-track tapes enjoyed only a brief period of popularity, thanks partly to Ford's decision to include them in their vehicles, developments in the audio industry were moving quickly past that era. One of the first magnetic recordings was made with steel wire at the turn of the 20th century. Cassette tape was introduced by RCA in 1958. It was as big as a video cassette. It was Lou Awden's goal at Philips in the 1960s for technology to be small enough to carry in a pocket. A few years later, he was successful, and the cassette tape entered the world. Albums recorded on cassette began appearing in 1966, and by the 1970s, cassette players had completely supplanted 8-track players in automobiles. Chapter 2. The Era of Cassette Tapes. Aside from professionally produced albums, early cassette tape use centered on personal recording because of its portability. Keeping this in mind, in 1966, Sony released the TC-100, which was about the size of an old answering machine and thus was unsuitable for portability but was perfectly at home on a desk or table. Small enough to fit in one hand and complete with its own microphone, the TC-50 model was released 2 years later. During the Apollo missions, NASA sent this prototype into space so astronauts could keep better records of their missions. 10 years later, Sony released the Pressman, a sleekly designed handheld cassette recorder widely used by reporters and business professionals. The Pressman was so well received that Sony claimed to have manufactured over 500,000 of them, which was remarkable for a niche product at the time. A successor to the Pressman, the Walkman, was bound to appear in stores by the time the Pressman did. Chapter 3. The Era of Walkman. By the late 1970s, when boomboxes first became popular, music had become an integral part of people's daily lives. It was awkward to play music too loud in some settings, and the bulky nature of these boomboxes made them cumbersome to transport. There was a great need for a more minor, more convenient audio player. In 1979, Sony's chairman, Masaru Ibuka, asked an employee, Norio Oga, develop a device that would allow him to listen to tapes while traveling internationally. Oga, with the Pressman as a starting point, developed a prototype in time for Ibuka's next flight, and the product itself went into production before the end of the year. The name Walkman was coined by combining the words Pressman and walk, alluding to the device's ability to provide users with discrete listening of music while on the move. Also in 1977, Andreas Pavel filed patents for a product he called the Stereo Belt, which was essentially a belt-mounted version of a portable music player like a Walkman. At the time of the Walkman's introduction, Pavel began royalty negotiations with Sony, which resulted in the company's initial agreement to pay royalties only in Germany. But Pavel kept insisting he was the actual inventor of the Walkman and kept filing lawsuits for nearly 25 years. Sony and Pavel resumed settlement talks in 2001, ultimately reaching a confidential settlement outside the court. Sony may or may not have known about Pavel's patents, but by paying him a few $1 million, they have ensured that they will be remembered as the creators of the Walkman. In 1979, Japan cautiously introduced the TPS L2, the world's first Walkman. Sony didn't know how the market would react, so they only made 30,000 of them initially, hoping to sell 5,000 a month. Chapter 4. The worldwide success. While initial sales were slow, the Walkman quickly became a hit among Japanese youth, and within 60 days, 50,000 had been sold. In 1980, Sony introduced the Walkman to the American market. Though it was bulkier and had lower sound quality than today's standards, the Walkman became an iconic device of the 1980s. Despite a sluggish beginning, the Walkman shot to fame and became a symbol of technological sophistication. Its original $200 price point, equivalent to $700 today, did not deter consumers, and soon enough, the demand for the Walkman significantly outpaced the supply. The Walkman has become an iconic piece of consumer electronics, changing how people listen to music and experience the world. By the time production ceased, an astounding 200 million Walkmans had been sold. For a long time, recording and distributing music was limited to vinyl records. With the introduction of the Walkman, cassettes suddenly became highly fashionable. Just a few years after the introduction of the Walkman in 1979, cassette tape sales had already surpassed record sales. Cassettes remained popular until 1990, mainly due to the success of the Walkman, despite the rise of CDs. Over 100 million Walkmans were sold throughout the 1990s, long after cassettes had lost their luster. Chapter 5. The Walkman's influence on mixtapes and personal identity. In the days before the Walkman, DJs and hip-hop artists would combine and layer songs to showcase their ability to create new sounds. The success of the Walkman did not prevent the ordinary person from creating audio compilations or mixtapes for their own use or sharing with others. The Walkman was instrumental in popularizing headphone culture and its mixtape iteration. The gadget was designed for use away from the house, where one would be jogging, gardening, or otherwise not near a stereo system. The Walkman allowed people to listen to music in private, allowing them to hear and share songs that might have been deemed inappropriate by parents or other adults in authority. Because of this, non-mainstream musical styles like punk and hip-hop could establish a firm foothold among young people and not be quickly rejected. It's a commonplace now to see people with headphones on, but kids of the 80s had the unique opportunity to create their own personal soundtracks for each stage of their lives. Chapter 6. The arrival of the Discman. With the success of the Walkman and the rise of CDs as the preferred audio format, Sony introduced the Discman in November 1984. The Discman was made more cumbersome to carry in a pocket due to the size of CDs, which may have contributed to the style of the 1990s, which featured large pockets. Compared to the Walkman, the Discman's major drawback was that it frequently skipped if not handled with care. Nevertheless, skip protection was developed in the early 1990s, which helped to alleviate the problem. The Discman's ability to pre-read and store data in its memory was essential to the success of this technology. The device would fall back on the backup data in the event of a disruption. The Discman was very similar to using a Walkman, except that it was much simpler to skip to a different song on the CD. This function helped pave the way for the widespread adoption of digital media and individualized playlists, which have largely replaced the practice of playing entire albums in their entirety. Chapter 7. Walkman's demise. Even the most groundbreaking changes to our way of life eventually fade away. Sony discontinued the Walkman in October 2010 despite strong sales. Somewhat unexpectedly, it has managed to maintain its popularity for so long. By 2010, technological advancements in audio playback surpassed physical media. The first iPod and Apple's iTunes platform had been out for nearly a decade by this point, giving people easy access to their favorite songs without having to physically go to a store. The iPod wasn't only sleek, but it also held an enormous amount of music, so there was no need to limit yourself to just a handful of tapes. Digital music delivered a killing blow to the Sony Walkman, much like music videos did to the radio star. However, there are still a few options on the market if you need a portable cassette player to listen to your classical music. Chapter 8. The Walkman's Impact on the World. Without the Walkman and how it has influenced our culture, the world would be very different today. It may no longer be in the spotlight, but its invention has left an indelible mark on history. The Discman and the iPod would not have been possible if the Walkman hadn't been around first. The Walkman sparked a worldwide craze for listening to music on headphones, which eventually led to wireless earbuds and the advent of music streaming services. When you listen to music, a podcast, or an audiobook while working out, gardening, or doing other chores, you can thank the Walkman. We owe a great deal to Andreas Pavel and a Sony executive who, on a flight, wanted to listen to some music and relax. Thank you for watching. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe and share.